Hello, my name is Nwachukwu, and in this video we are going to explore and gain an understanding of the history of sampling and its context within music production and sound design today. The use of sound samples and the process of sampling audio material has been one of the most fundamental building blocks of contemporary music since its inception. Producers and artists across generations and genres have utilized the technologies at their disposal in ways that inventors couldn't imagine. Samples are everywhere. In the music we listen to, the ROM-based digital hardware instruments we work with, and many of the commonly used plugins available today. How did this come to be? To gain an understanding, we need to initially explore the world of musique concrète pioneered by French composer Pierre Schaeffer, who, along with his collaborator Pierre Henry, pushed the boundaries of the use of analog tape by recording all kinds of objects of interest. Then, using techniques such as chopping and pitching sections, splicing, tape reversing, ultimately transformed the sounds beyond conventional use. Many of their techniques and approaches were incorporated into the first wave of digital instruments and still used today. So what is sampling? Technically speaking, in our world of digital audio, it is the recording of audio material which is converted into a string of numbers based in binary, ones and zeros. The string of numbers is created by measuring the amplitude, height of a waveform at regular intervals. Each interval or snapshot of audio material is called a sample. The more samples used to represent the audio material, the better the quality of the recorded, sampled audio material. So, for example, the audio material or sound to be sampled at 44.1 kHz 16-bit, this equates to a sample rate of 44,100 times per second and an amplitude, height of a range of 65,536 values. A big number. This number is actually the binary equivalent of 2 to the power of 16. So, 44.1 kHz 16-bit is actually the CD reference standard for audio material and benchmark for high quality. Nowadays, however, it is very common to see much higher sample rates, particularly in the world of mastering and audio processing within instruments and plugins we use. The Fairlight CMI was the first commercially available musical instrument to harness the power of sampling. Developed in 1979 by Kim Ryrie and Peter Vogel, it was very, very expensive. And with a price tag of in excess of $25,000, which is roughly around $100,000 in today's money, only major artists and studios could afford to buy one. Early adopters of the time include Stevie Wonder, Peter Gabriel, Herbie Hancock, Kate Bush, and The Art of Noise. Groundbreaking for the time, the Fairlight could sample in 8-bit with a sample rate of 24 kHz, quite gritty and lo-fi by today's standards. It became widely used in popular music and recordings of the early to mid-80s, and its most commonly used library presets included an orchestral stab called Orc 5 and a breathy vocal sample called R1, thus being credited as helping set the standard for some of the key sounds of early hip-hop and dance music styles. Developed around the same time was New England Digital's Synclavier workstation. Like the Fairlight, it was initially developed as a digital synthesizer with powerful FM and additive synthesis capabilities, with sampling added later. Both systems in time evolved to feature dedicated sequencer pages, synchronization to external devices, and later hard disk recording. Both instruments were very popular and found a home in both film and broadcast industries. The early 80s saw rapid growth and development in silicon chip-based technologies. This and the success of the Fairlight inspired companies like EMU Systems, who pivoted into a world of digital instruments after success with their keybeds and modular synthesizers. Their emulator was released in 1981, which at $8,000 was a fraction of the cost of the Fairlight or its Synclavier. It had only 2-second sampling time and at 8-bit 27 kHz could store sounds on 5-inch floppy disks. Its successor, the Emulator 2, followed in 1984. This classic had many new features for the time, including MIDI, which was only introduced a year before, SMPTE Sync, and computer control. Editing functionality for samples included truncating, auto and manual auto looping, reversing, velocity switch crossfading, and splicing samples. With a price tag of $1,700, the Ensoniq Mirage really brought affordable sampling to musicians. The Mirage was also an 8-bit sampler, capable of maximum sampling time of 32 kHz, but with a limited 128 kilobytes of RAM. It could store sounds on the newer 3.5-inch dual floppy disk drives, which had more capacity and durability compared to its 5-inch counterpart. We cannot talk samplers and the 80s without mentioning the Akai S series of samplers, which kicked off with the S612 in 85. They really made their mark with the S900, which was released a year later, at prices comparable to the Mirage. It was rack-mountable, a soon-to-be popular space-saving format, and provided pro quality for the time. 12-bit stereo with variable sample rates of between 7.5 kHz and 40 kHz, and with maximum of 63-second sampling time at 7.5 kHz. Up to 32 samples could also be created and stored to the internal floppy disk drive, along with any editing settings. The S950 soon followed, offering increased memory and sampling rates variable from 7.5 to 48 kHz, and could hold 99 samples in memory. Internal RAM memory could also be expanded from the initial 750 kilobytes to 2.25 megabytes. By the late 80s, Akai samplers were everywhere. The S1000 in particular became the professional studio staple from its release in 1988. Stereo, 16-bit at 22 up to 44.1 kHz, with a standard 2 megabytes of RAM expandable to 32 megabytes of RAM. It had unique functionality such as time stretching and compression and extensive analog style synthesis. It seemed like no studio in the world could be without one, especially as the Akai sample library became so extensive and ubiquitous. Drum machines began to incorporate digital technology with the release of the LM1 in 1980. Developed by Roger Linn, it was the first to contain recordings of real acoustic instruments, which were stored on erasable programmable read-only memory, or EPROMs as they're known. It featured real and step-time programming with quantize and swing, also a first. The LM1 was followed by the Linn drum and its rival, the Obi-Hum DMX, in 1982. These machines put sample-based rhythms into the hearts and minds of musicians, most notably Prince. However, it wasn't until the release of EMU's SP12 that musicians really had the opportunity to incorporate sampling into their drum machine workflow. It had a set of preset drum sounds, including kick, snare, hi-hats, toms and cymbals, hand clap and rim shot. These sounds could be mixed and edited using the sliders. Then, using the built-in 12-bit sampler, users could sample their own percussion sounds and beats. It was superseded by the SP1200 in 1987, which along with extended memory had no preset sounds in ROM and included a 3.5-inch floppy drive for storing samples, sequences and songs. Akai released the MPC-60 in 1987, and along with the SP12 and 1200, it won the hearts and minds of hip-hop and house producers the world over. Unlike the gritty 12-bit 26 kHz sound of the EMUs, the Roger Linn designed MPC-60 was 12-bit at 40 kHz. With its extensive workstation-like sequencing capabilities, this machine won favour with the then emerging R&B and New Jack Swing generation of producers, including Teddy Riley. On from the 1980s, where computers such as the Atari 520 and 1040 were primarily used for MIDI sequencing duties, the 1990s brought cheaper computing power, larger RAM memory capacity, and increased hard drive size and speeds. Manufacturers sought to leverage some of this emerging power. Early use of this included RAM-based sample playback system Sample Cell by DigiDesign. Originally released in 1991, a setup included a bespoke card for Apple Macintosh computers with new bus slots. The system also included an extensive CD-based sample library, which could also read the now ubiquitous Akai library format. The first sampler to exclusively work with PC power was the Nemesis Gigasampler. It was the first sampler of its kind to incorporate direct-to-disk hard drive streaming of samples. This meant sample libraries could utilize the internal hard drive capacity for samples, up to gigabytes in some cases, rather than relying solely on the internal RAM, which at the time was often up to 32 megabytes, thus opening the door to more complex realistic sounding, multi-layered sample libraries pioneered by companies like Spectrasonic, East West and Zero G. With the emergence of the Steinberg-developed VST2 format standard in 1999, the world of MIDI sequencing and digital audio processing utilizing computer power had truly come of age. For samplers, this kicked off with Steinberg's Hallion in 2001, followed by Native Instruments with Battery and Contact in 2002. The latter soon became the industry standard with the ability to support most major sample formats of the time, including Akai S1000 and 3000, Soundfont 2, Gigasampler, Hallion, Logic Audio EXS24, SND, WAV and A files, Sample Cell Sound Design 2 files, as well as Native Instruments battery files. It also featured very powerful sample modes called Tone and Time Machine, which offer sample mangling features based on granular resynthesis and real-time time stretching and pitch shifting respectively. The constant release of new libraries and the framework licensing opportunity to third-party developers has secured dominance and increased market share for Contact over the years. Originally released in 2001, Ableton took a distinctively different performance-led approach to all its DAW counterparts. The ability to warp audio tracks, adjusting the tempo of digital recordings without affecting its pitch, was a staple in many samplers, but the way Ableton's Live handled this was revolutionary at the time, giving producers and DJs new ways to mangle and combine audio, samples and looped elements in new, exciting ways. Once the tempo and warp points, beat markers, of an audio clip have been identified, Live's time-stretching algorithms and auto-tempo analysis makes it possible to carry out real-time synchronization of tempo, quantize beats, and apply swing. These features were game-changing at the time. Version 4 of Live, released in 2004, introduced many new features, which included extensive MIDI sequencing, VST integration for Windows, and VST and audio units for Mac, and the ability to record and edit MIDI note information, and incorporated sample instruments, Simpler, Impulse, Sampler, all of which reside within Live in enhanced, feature-rich versions today. So whether taking inspiration from one of Arturia's reimagined classics of the early 80s, or the integrated 16-pad paradigm offered by Native Instruments' machine platform, or Akai's evolving MPC production line, as well as their mobile counterparts, producers and artists have so much choice when it comes to exploring and utilizing a sample and sample-based workflow. So, what are the ethics of sampling? Over the years, the use of sampled material has been one of many discussions, depending on which side of ownership or rights spectrum you're on. Whilst many rights holders are open to the possibility and potential of what samples offer in terms of new perspectives and markets for their material, many have had reservations and often pursue legal action to ensure rights are upheld. So essentially, if you record your own samples, for example field recordings, hitting and recording innate objects, or even acoustic instruments, these are your samples and you own the rights to these samples. So it's up to you whether you choose to apply certain restrictions to their use or make them publicly available for some kind of compensation. Commercial sample libraries that you have purchased or made available as part of a package when you buy a plugin or an instrument are usually licensed to you royalty-free. This means you don't have to pay the rights holder to use the samples. You have permission to incorporate them in your music, which can be sold commercially, but you are not permitted to sell or pass on any of these samples. Music that is commercially available, i.e. released on vinyl, CD or streaming services, is usually copyrighted material. It usually means that you don't have permission to record, sample or even duplicate the material without express permission from the rights holders. There are two separate copyrights which exist in any recording. The first is the copyright in the sound recording, sometimes called the master rights. These rights are usually controlled by the label or producer of the original recording. The second is the copyright in the underlying composition. The composer of the music will be the author of the song, and the lyric in the composition will also be protected by copyright as a literary work. These rights will usually be controlled by the writer and/or the publisher of the composition. Where there are several writers and or publishers and you want to clear a sample, you'll need to clear it with each writer independently of each other. If you use a sample without gaining prior approval from the rights owner, you will be infringing the owner's intellectual property rights, which are protected under law by the Copyright Act. The use of their copyrighted material commercially or for profit in any manner, including any promotional use or on digital platforms such as YouTube and SoundCloud, will open you up to legal action. If your track is released with an uncleared sample in it and enjoys any level of success, then the likelihood is that you'll have to give the copyright owner some or often all your royalties made from the track as compensation for what is called willful infringement. Hence the old saying, where there's a hit, there's a writ. So as a rights holder, you may not want to be so strict about how people use your work. This is where Creative Commons licenses make a big difference. You are able to choose the criteria for what people can share, adapt or remix your work, whether someone is using your work for educational or for commercial use. Lastly, there is public domain samples. These are creative works, audio recordings in our case, that are free from copyright, where no exclusive intellectual property rights apply. These rights may have expired or been forfeited or expressively waived or may be inapplicable. These can be found online at places like the US Library of Congress or the Internet Archive. Check some of the services and platforms that have emerged that embrace different approaches. How will you utilize sampling in your music production?